Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Kiorkof, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, I'm going to be talking about my top 36 wide receiver rankings for the 2024 fantasy football season. Over the course of today's episode, I'm going to be introducing all of these wide receivers and justifying their overall rankings with statistics. Now, before we get into today's content, because there are many of wide receivers to talk about, couple reminders, any statistic that I do present is going to be for a half PPR scoring format, meaning everyone in the middle, whether you do play in a standard league or a full PPR league. Additionally, if you want to hear my specific thoughts on a particular wide receiver, you can travel down to the description and check out the timestamps. I have timestamps in my description of every single video for the remainder of the season, so you can check those out. While you're down there, if you have not yet already, be sure to subscribe, click the like button. I greatly appreciate all the support as we are on our way to 100,000 subscribers. I greatly appreciate all the comments you guys left on yesterday's video. That stuff makes my day. Thank you very much. Additionally, last but definitely not least, while you're down in the description, if you are interested in catching my 2024 fantasy football draft guide and rankings, you can check out the Patreon or head on over to Underdog Fantasy. At this current moment in time, if you sign up using code Andrew and make a first-time deposit minimum of $10, not only will you be able to claim the deposit offer, you're going to get my 2024 fantasy football draft guide, the rankings, subsequent updates to those rankings sent from my email directly to yours, and additionally, you'll get email rankings every single Sunday morning from weeks 1 through 18. These rankings are all positions, including flex, half PPR, full PPR, all encompassing. So for those of you guys who want to get your hands on my 2024 fantasy football draft guide, have an advantage upon your league mates, be sure to check that out today. Check out the map to the right side of the screen to determine your eligibility in terms of signing up and making that first time deposit via Underdog Fantasy. And of course, draft responsibly. Thank you very much. All right, let's get into talking about my top 36 wide receivers, beginning with the number one, Tyreek Hill. Now, when I approach my ranking, specifically the number one player at a position, I'm looking for sustained excellence, and that's exactly what Tyreek Hill has demonstrated over the course of his entire career. I mean, in 5 of the last 6 seasons that he has played, he's been a top 6 wide receiver in fantasy football. Additionally, in the last 2 seasons as a member of the Miami Dolphins, he's been the number 2 wide receiver in both seasons. With Tua Tagovailoa under center and healthy, over the course of the last 2 years, Tyreek Hill is averaging 10.78 targets per game and 19.69 fantasy points per game in a half PPR scoring format. And even though many are looking towards CeeDee Lamb to once again reclaim the number 1 wide receiver standing, I think the sustained excellence of Tyreek Hill makes him an automatic pick in the early first round of our drafts. I mean, last season, amongst all wide receivers, he had the highest target percentage. He was targeted on 36.31% of the routes that he ran. Additionally, he had a 3.82 yards per route run average, which is the number 1 amongst all receivers in the last decade. Tyreek Hill is a special player, a future Hall of Famer, and of course, he can get it done whether it's in the slot or within the deep routes. I mean, last season, amongst all wide receivers, he was number 1 on all deep receiving categories, whether it's targets, receptions, receiving yards, and receiving touchdowns, and he's not slowing down as we approach 2024. Now, speaking of potentially the consensus number 1 wide receiver across the board, a lot of people are talking about CeeDee Lamb potentially reclaiming that going into 2024, and I don't blame them. He had an incredible 2023 season, obviously because of Mike McCarthy taking over the play calling duty in comparison to Kellen Moore, who had that overall responsibility in 2023. Mike McCarthy really put an emphasis and focus on getting CeeDee Lamb the ball at a far more consistent rate in comparison to seasons past. And of course, he delivered. He averaged last season from weeks 1 through 19, so the regular season all the way into the playoffs, 11 targets per game and 19.54 fantasy points per game in a half PPR scoring format. Additionally, amongst all wide receivers in the National Football League, he demonstrated that he was the most elite within the slot position, garnering the most targets, receptions, receiving yards, and receiving touchdowns from the slot position last year. Additionally, he dominated within the red zone, which is a huge difference maker amongst all wide receivers, especially when you have one that is scoring double-digit touchdowns, specifically leading the league in terms of overall red zone targets and touchdowns in 2023. Hopefully, he can go ahead and recreate that in 2024. It shouldn't be difficult, especially considering this offense hasn't really brought in any other target competition. Hopefully, Jerry Jones can get CeeDee Lamb the contract that he wants. He can get back onto the field and participate in training camp because, of course, if he is to hold out, that could have some diminishing factors over the course of the season. So hopefully, he'll get a brand new contract and be ready to go. Now, let's move on to our number 3, the beginning of the A tier, potentially a player that could be the dark horse number 1 overall wide receiver when it's all said and done by the end of the 2024 year. It is Ja'Marr Chase of the Cincinnati Bengals. The reason why I present this is because he's been hyper efficient and consistent over the course of the last 3 years. As a member of the Cincinnati Bengals with a healthy Joe Burrow, we have seen Ja'Marr Chase be the number 5 overall wide receiver in fantasy points per game on average in all 3 seasons, 2021, 2022, and 2023. 2023. Specifically, if you go back to last year, in games in which Joe Burrow was relatively healthy and wasn't hobbling around with his calf injury, so I marked that as weeks 3 through 10, Ja'Marr Chase was averaging 11.71 targets per game and 19.11 fantasy points per game. The first 2 weeks of the season was an absolute disaster due to the overall calf injury of Joe Burrow, and hopefully as we approach the 2024 year, we can kind of avoid all injuries in the case of Joe Burrow, considering, of course, he has dealt with his fair share over the course of the last couple seasons. Specifically, when we go back to 2021, his training camp was littered with, the ACL recovery. The next year was the appendectomy. The year after that, of course, most recently, the calf injury. I know he's coming off the wrist surgery, but hopefully he'll be good to go. There'll be no setbacks. And of course, that'll help elevate Ja'Marr Chase, because that's exactly what Ja'Marr Chase has done every season. He elevates his game. He has improved. I mean, when you look at his 2022 stats with a healthy Joe Burrow, averaging 11.17 targets per game. So, of course, there was a jump in 2023, and 16.58 fantasy points per game. These are all great numbers, but he continues to improve as we approach. I'm expecting Ja'Marr Chase to take even further steps forward and hopefully get into the conversation of potentially finishing as the number 1 overall wide receiver in fantasy football. Moving on to our next wide receiver, we have our number 4, Amon-Ra St. Brown of the Detroit Lions. Last season had himself an incredible year from weeks 1 through 21. So the regular season up until the NFC Championship game, he was averaging 10.42 targets per game and 16.63 fantasy points per game. In games last season in which Amon-Ra St. Brown was targeted 9 or more times, he was averaging 18.3 fantasy points per game. Again, he had 9 or more targets within 14 of the 19 games in which he participated in. Again, a lot of overall production. And this all took place while Amon-Ra St. Brown was dealing with a severe oblique injury from the Netflix show Wide Receiver. We were given information this offseason that Amon-Ra St. Brown early in the year had an injured oblique. According to what he said, tore it off the bone. At least that's what the doctors told him. And he continued to play through it throughout the entirety of the 23 season. So going into 2024, healthy, ready to go, a tough son of a gun to say the very least. He's one of the most elite wide receivers in the league, especially within the slot, was number 2 amongst all receivers, only behind CeeDee Lamb in all of the categories of targets, receptions, receiving yards, etc. But the way that they utilize him within the slot, creating, mismatches against linebackers, against safeties that truly just cannot cover him, the way that they utilize him, and the fact that he found himself open on 81.5% of the overall targets that he saw last season, I think there's just going to be continued success for Amon-Ra St. Brown going into 2024. Now, speaking of injuries and players who may have missed a little bit of time last season, but still is an elite wide receiver, I want to mention Justin Jefferson as my number 5. Justin Jefferson is an elite wide receiver. Ever since joining the league, his rookie season was the number 6 overall wide receiver. The following year, number 4. The next year after that, topped the entire charts, finishing as the number 1 overall wide receiver. And unfortunately, last year dealt with his fair share of injuries and finished as wide receiver 29 overall in a half PPR scoring format. But as we go into 2024, we have a little bit of a different looking Minnesota Vikings offense. I mean, after Justin Jefferson got hurt in 2023, he returned to a different quarterback, and going into 2024, we'll have a completely different quarterback than those that he experienced last season. So with no Kirk Cousins, the question is, can Justin Jefferson continue to improve in terms of his statistics overall, like he has proven over the course of his first 4 seasons? I mean, in his rookie year, averaged 14.4 fantasy points per game. The year after, 16.3. The year after that, 18.7. Most recently, he was averaging 20.03 fantasy points per game. And hopefully he can continue that sustained excellence going into 2024, having averaged, 11.38 targets last season. But when you look at his overall participation and his overall performances without Kirk Cousins, specifically in 2023 with Nick Mullins or Jaron Hall, he still got himself a boatload of opportunity and production, 11 targets per game and 18.35 fantasy points per game. So I'm not worried about the potential of Sam Darnold or JJ McCarthy taking over the starting quarterback position going into 2024. I'm confident that Kevin O'Connell, the primary play caller of this offense, and the head coach, the offensive-minded head coach that has elevated this team, is going to continue to flow the offense through Justin Jefferson, continue to give him the ball regardless of who the quarterback is. I'm confident in that. And hopefully they do name a starter sooner rather than later, and especially if it's Sam Darnold, it'll give me more confidence drafting Justin Jefferson this season. But nonetheless, I still love him as a top 5 wide receiver. Moving on to the B tier, we begin with our number 6, A.J. Brown, who's coming off of back-to-back seasons in which he has been a top 7 fantasy wide receiver. As soon as he joined the Philadelphia Eagles, we already knew that there was going to be a connection between him and Jalen Hurts because they're best friends off the field, whether they were on the same team or not. But now that they have continued to practice together and build a rapport, I mean, they're putting up great numbers. Last season, A.J. Brown set career highs in terms of targets and receptions, which is a great overall number. Obviously, a lot of those targets being taken away from someone like DeVonta Smith and going in his direction, which obviously led to him breaking the record for most consecutive games of 125 or more receiving yards within a single season. He was able to accomplish 6 consecutive games within those overall stats early last season, which obviously gave him a huge jump start. But last year, when healthy, averaging 9.8 targets per game and 14.83 fantasy points per game in games over the course of the last 2 seasons with Jalen Hurts, in which he's been given 8 or more targets, averaging over 18 fantasy points per game, and has been able to get himself 8 or more targets in 23 of the last 33 games that he has played. My biggest concern for A.J. Brown is just red zone opportunity. There seems to be a lack of that within the Philadelphia Eagles offense, whether it is for A.J. Brown, DeVonta Smith, and or Dallas Goedert. The contributions of Jalen Hurts and the running backs, specifically in terms of them scoring rushing touchdowns over the course of the last 2 seasons, has been heavy. And hopefully we can go ahead and spread that out and give more opportunity to A.J. Brown. But even if they don't, I still expect him to be a top 6 wide receiver going into 2024. Moving on to our number 7, we have Garrett Wilson, who is coming off of back-to-back 1,000-yard receiving seasons, which, was able to be accomplished with 6 different starting quarterbacks, and the vast majority of that quarterback play coming from Zach Wilson, as we all know, not the greatest quarterback in NFL history. Specifically, if you look at Garrett Wilson's rookie year, 2022, 64% of his overall targets were deemed catchable. Not a great number. The following year, only 68% of his overall targets were deemed catchable. But now we get the return of Aaron Rodgers. Aaron Rodgers has demonstrated over the course of his long career, from 2008 to 2022, Aaron Rodgers' number 1 wide receivers average 131 targets, 86 receptions, 1,186 receiving yards, and 10 receiving touchdowns. The fact that Garrett Wilson has already been able to complete 2 1,000-yard receiving seasons with Zach Wilson only makes me believe that with Aaron Rodgers, we should be anticipating 1,400, 1,500, maybe 1,600 receiving yards. I do believe that double-digit touchdowns is in the realm of possibility for Garrett Wilson this season. It really will matter as to how this offense wants to function within the red zone, but nonetheless should be a fantastic player and at base minimum the number 7 wide receiver by the end of the 2024 year. Now, after talking about one former Offensive Rookie of the Year in Garrett Wilson, let's talk about a wide receiver who last season was snubbed from being the Offensive Rookie of the Year. That is Puka Nacua of the Los Angeles Rams, coming off of a season in which he set the record for most receptions and receiving yards by a wide receiver in rookie wide receiver in NFL history. Pretty crazy numbers. Came out the gates on fire from weeks 1 through 4 without Cooper Kupp in the lineup, garnering 13 targets per game on average and scoring 19 fantasy points per game on average. Obviously made a huge difference in many of our leagues as the week 1 stud pickup in a lot of scenarios. Now, even after Cooper Kupp returned in games in which, of course, Cooper Kupp was active and Matthew Stafford was healthy, Puka Nacua was still great, averaging 8.75 targets and 15.13 fantasy points per game from weeks 5 through 19. Again, incredible overall production. Sean McVay approached last season in giving Puka Nacua as much opportunity as possible, and once he went ahead and demonstrated that he is capable of being within the Cooper Kupp role, they gave him that role for the remainder of the year. There's a reason why he had an open target rate of 82%, which was even higher than Amon-Ra St. last season. He's a physical wide receiver that will play through injuries, and he'll play through contact. Last season, amongst all wide receivers, he was number 1 in terms of receiving yards after contact with 372. He had 627 yards after the catch, number 5 amongst all wide receivers. And similar to guys like Jamar Chase, Justin Jefferson, Jaylen Waddle, Amon-Ra St. who have themselves big rookie years, I expect Puka Nacua to continue his success going into 2024. Now, while on the subject of rookie wide receivers that, again, should have been Rookie of the Year, were Rookie of the Year, let's talk about one that may end up capturing the Rookie of the Year in 2024. That is Marvin Harrison Jr. to begin the C tier. Marvin Harrison Jr., of course, we all know the story. His father's a Hall of Famer within the National Football League, a great wide receiver for the Indianapolis Colts and those great teams of the past. He has learned from his father and obviously gotten himself to being, a top 5 pick in the NFL draft based on all of his overall accolades that he was able to accomplish at Ohio State. But I want to go ahead and talk about the history of fantasy football and wide receivers drafted this high. Specifically, since 2014, there have been 11 different wide receivers that were drafted within the top 10 of NFL drafts. 7 of those 11 wide receivers had full healthy seasons. They averaged 127 targets, 77 receptions, 1,055 receiving yards, 7 receiving touchdowns, and 186.41 fantasy points on average. Now, those overall numbers, in my opinion, would be the baseline of production out of Marvin Harrison Jr., especially when we consider he is joining an offense that already has an established quarterback like Kyler Murray. He's not joining an offense that has Daniel Jones. Sorry, Malik Nabers, you're going to be far lower ranked because of that, but Marvin Harrison has an advantage right out the gate considering the quarterback, contribution and production that we will immediately see. You look at Kyler Murray's most recent wide receiver runs in seasons past. You go back to 2020, DeAndre Hopkins in that year, 10 targets per game and 14.99 fantasy points per game. You go to 2022, Hollywood Brown, prior to the return of DeAndre Hopkins within that overall season. Obviously, DeAndre Hopkins served 6 games within a suspension, and then after that, Hollywood Brown went to the IR. But prior to that, Hollywood Brown, 10.7 targets per game, 14.67 fantasy points per game. Outside of Trey McBride, there really isn't much target competition within this offense. I know they have like Zay Jones, they have the backfield. They have guys like Greg Dortch, Michael Wilson Jr. Again, not incredible target competition outside of Trey McBride. I expect Marvin Harrison Jr. to make an immediate impact and, of course, dominate for our fantasy teams. Moving on to our number 10, we have Drake London, who over the course of the last 2 seasons has unfortunately played within an offense that has been a run-first scheme, and that is certainly going to change. And not only that, his quarterback is going to change and improve drastically, going from guys like Marcus Mariota and Desmond Ridder, which limited him to pretty much being a wide receiver 3, now has an opportunity with Kirk Cousins to potentially get into that top 10 conversation, which I expect him to reach in 2024. Last season, this offense was number 32 amongst all teams, last in terms of wide receiver targets. That's a pretty ridiculous number when you're not passing the ball very much and you're handing it off 450 times, the most times amongst all teams in the National Football League in 2023. Hopefully the offensive change by bringing in someone like Zach Robinson as the offensive coordinator, the former passing game coordinator of the Los Angeles Rams over the last 2 consecutive seasons. He is going to be bringing in a Kevin O'Connell-esque scheme. And the reason I bring up Kevin O'Connell, the head coach of the Minnesota Vikings, is because, of course, Kevin O'Connell, the former play caller for Kirk Cousins last season, but also a former Rams offensive coordinator in the season in which they won the Super Bowl. So there is a lot of similarities within this offense. And if they're going to utilize Drake London in the Justin Jefferson or Puka Nacua, Cooper Kupp role within this offense, which again, we expect to see, we should see a lot of production going in his direction, a lot of opportunity especially. When we look at Kirk Cousins and his number 1 wide receivers over the course of the last couple seasons, 2018 through 2022, his number 1 wide receivers on a 17-game pace have averaged 155 targets, 107 receptions, nearly 1,600 receiving yards, 9 touchdowns, and 270 fantasy points. And that has been spread out between guys like Thielen, Diggs, and of course, Justin Jefferson. Jefferson being a completely different machine, but even in seasons in which, of course, Diggs and Thielen were the number 1, they had themselves incredible seasons, which I anticipate for Drake London to have this year. Over the course of the last 2 seasons, when Drake London has just been given a base of 8 or more targets in a singular game, he's averaging 13.1 fantasy points per game. I'm hoping for him to step up and, of course, for Kirk Cousins to help him elevate into this top 10 conversation. Now, when Drake London was coming out of college, he was very much so compared to Mike Evans. So while on the topic, let's go ahead and talk about our number 11, the future Hall of Famer Mike Evans, who is coming off of 10 consecutive seasons of a minimum of 1,000 receiving yards. He's been ranked as a top 12 wide receiver in 7 of the last 10 years. And not only that, he has played 154 of his eligible 163 games. It's a 95% rate. He stays healthy, he stays on the field, and he stays producing. Last season had himself an incredible year in which he had 8.44 targets per game, but still was able to deliver with 14.92 fantasy points per game. Obviously, touchdowns made a huge difference, especially the impact within the deep receiving game. Was top 4 in all categories in terms of targets, receptions, receiving yards, receiving touchdowns. Was number 1 amongst all receivers in terms of air yards. Again, there's a lot of potential there available when you're getting targets deep down the field to make plays, and that's exactly what Mike Evans did. Now, if you told me this time last year that Baker Mayfield was going to be better for Mike Evans than Tom Brady ever was, I wouldn't have believed you, but that's exactly how it played out. Nonetheless, going into 2024, I do anticipate a little bit of regression out of Mike Evans, mainly just within the touchdown overall numbers. I don't expect that his targets, receptions, receiving yards are going to diminish much. I think scoring 13 touchdowns is not very sustainable unless, of course, you're going to get yourself a high volume of red zone opportunities. Sure, he can make plays deep within the receiving game, 20, 30, 40 plus yards down the field. If he can do that, which again, he's definitely capable of, he's a future Hall of Famer, it wouldn't surprise me. But nonetheless, I do anticipate a little bit of regression in comparison to last year. Still a top 12 standing. Now, speaking of future Hall of Fame wide receivers, let's go ahead and bring up the conversation to Davante Adams, who going into this upcoming season will have a quarterback competition on his hands, very similar to a guy like Justin Jefferson, but we still believe in the talent. Over the course of the last 2 years within the Las Vegas Raiders offense, he is ranked as the number 3 and the number 11 overall wide receiver. Last year, from weeks 1 through 8, while Josh McDaniels was still the head coach and primary play caller, he was averaging 9.75 targets per game and only 11.93 fantasy points per game. But once, in fact, they got Josh McDaniels out of the overall picture, the opportunities and the production went up for Davante Adams, even with Aiden O'Connell as the starting quarterback. 10.78 targets per game and 13.17 fantasy points per game, weeks 9 through 18 without Josh McDaniels in the overall picture. Now, like I mentioned earlier, there is going to be a quarterback competition on hand. Gardner Minshew was brought in for that exact competition, and Gardner Minshew last season, as a starting quarterback of the Indianapolis Colts from weeks 1 through 14, he targeted Michael Pittman Jr. 10.6 times per game. That led to a 13.38 fantasy point per game average for Michael Pittman Jr. throughout that span of time, 9 of which his 13 games consisted of double-digit targets. So we know that regardless of who's going to play quarterback for this team, double-digit targets are going in the direction of Davante Adams, who is an elite player, even though he is getting up there in age. What we continue to see is that these elite-level route runners, regardless of age, continue to find success. And as long as the opportunity is there, I'm expecting for Davante Adams to be a wide receiver one. Now, speaking of opportunity, one of the players that gets the least volume of opportunity amongst the elite wide receivers, a guy that is looking for a contract very soon, is Brandon Aiyuk. Brandon Aiyuk, I mean, just looking at the overall numbers, in 2022 with Brock Purdy, averaged 6.67 targets per game, 10.57 fantasy points per game in 2022. But in 2023, the number didn't go up much. Only 6.73 targets per game, but 13.85 fantasy points per game. With those overall lack of opportunities, has been the number 15 and the number 14 overall wide receiver in fantasy football on a half PPR scoring format over the course of the last 2 seasons. So just imagine if he was in a situation in which he was given double-digit targets on a weekly basis. Imagine if he was in Davante Adams' position, the volume of production we could potentially see out of Brandon Aiyuk. But nonetheless, going into 2024, we have a wide receiver here that, regardless of the lack of opportunity, is going to deliver. I mean, over the course of the last 2 seasons, games in which he's had 6 or more targets, he's averaging 14.49 fantasy points per game. That is 15 of the last 21 games that he has played. Again, a lot of potential for production here. He was the number 3 wide receiver in terms of yards per route run last season, number 21 in terms of wide receiver yards after the catch. He is going to make a lot of noise this season, especially considering he's trying to prove himself and get a contract if, in fact, they don't sign him to one during training camp. Moving on to our number 14, we have Stefon Diggs, who is changing jerseys this year, going from the Buffalo Bills to the Houston Texans. Was traded this offseason for a second-round pick. And prior to the trade, as a member of the Buffalo Bills, I mean, he had ranked as a top 10 wide receiver for fantasy football in each of the last 4 seasons. Additionally, 4 straight seasons of over 100 receptions and 6 straight seasons of over 1,000 receiving yards. Again, an elite wide receiver to say the very least. And he demonstrated that early last season from weeks 1 through 10 with Ken Dorsey as the offensive coordinator. 10.2 targets per game, 16.5 fantasy points per game. But unfortunately, as soon as the offensive coordinator switch happened, unfortunately, Stefon Diggs became an afterthought within this offense because it purely just became a matter of, can we run the ball as much as possible? And that's what they did. They ran the ball a boatload within the Buffalo Bills offense from weeks 11 through 20, which unfortunately led to Stefon Diggs only averaging 8.33 targets per game and 7.56 fantasy points per game. Honestly, I think Stefon Diggs changing homes is the best thing for him, especially considering the entire offensive philosophy change within the Buffalo Bills. So going to the Houston Texans, sure, it provides more target competition with Nico Collins, Tank Dell, Dalton Schultz, Joe Mixon. But I do believe the way that they're going to utilize Stefon Diggs, or which they've kind of alluded to over the course of this offseason, is going to allow him to continue to be an elite wide receiver for fantasy purposes. We have heard rumors over the course of this entire offseason that Originally, the Houston Texans wanted to get their hands on Keenan Allen rather than Stefon Diggs because they were looking for a wide receiver to play that Z role, the flanker, slot receiver role. And that's exactly what Bobby Slowick, the offensive coordinator of the Houston Texans, plans on doing and has alluded to this offseason. He has mentioned that on multiple occasions that Stefon Diggs is a great receiver after the catch, balls in hand, can make a lot of plays, within short yardage situations. So they're going to use him as a Keenan Allen, as a, Z receiver within the slot position to dominate against mismatches over the course of this entire season. So you can leave Nico Collins on the outside. They're not going to dig into each other's overall contributions. I expect the elite route running nature of Keenan Allen to seamlessly fit within this offense to have himself a great season. Moving on to our number 15, we have DJ Moore of the Chicago Bears. Last season with Justin Fields on the field, healthy, ready to go, DJ Moore was averaging 8.25 targets per game and 16.81 fantasy points per game. And even if we exclude this 45-point performance that DJ Moore, put up against the Washington Commanders on that Thursday night game, even if we exclude that, he was still averaging 14.25 fantasy points per game. His overall contributions within the deep receiving game, 20 or 30 yards plus down the field, was top 4 in all 4 categories: targets, receptions, receiving yards, and receiving touchdowns. And I anticipate that to continue going into 2024 because of the new implementation of this offense with Shane Waldron. Shane Waldron, the new offensive coordinator, was the former offensive coordinator of the Seattle Seahawks from 2021 to 2023. Throughout that span of time, of course, was able to elevate DK Metcalf as the number 12, the number 18, and the number 16 overall wide receiver in fantasy football. And even Tyler Lockett throughout those seasons was the number 13, the number 13, and the number 33 wide receiver within fantasy football half PPR. So we've seen a lot of wide receivers succeed within a Shane Waldron offense. Last season, amongst all teams, they targeted their wide receivers the 10th most times, while the Chicago Bears the 31st most times, the second lowest amongst all teams in the National Football League. I expect that if Shane Waldron can make Geno Smith an elite level quarterback in any sort of capacity, I can only imagine what he's going to be able to accomplish with Caleb Williams and, of course, DJ Moore, who just inked a brand new deal. Moving on to our 16, we have Deebo Samuel, another wide receiver from the San Francisco 49ers offense that should find himself a lot of success, but it's just a matter of, can Deebo Samuel stay healthy? Because the last 2 seasons that Deebo Samuel has been healthy, he has finished as a wide receiver 1, top 12 within the overall position. I mean, specifically, you go back to last season, in games in which he was healthy, 6.62 targets per game, again, not a great number, 2.61 attempts per game in terms of rushing attempts, all for an average of 16.03 fantasy points per game. He is an elite overall producer, whether it's on the ground, through the air. Kyle Shanahan truly knows how to utilize Deebo Samuel's skills and abilities to find the maximum overall potential. I mean, just looking at last season, in games in which he had 4 or more targets, averaging 17.98 fantasy points per game. Okay, those are 11 of his 13 healthy games. And of those 11 games in which he had 4 or more targets, 8 of them consisted of over 13.5 fantasy points and a half PPR. Amongst all wide receivers in 2023, with a minimum of 25 targets, he was number 1 in terms of yards after the catch per reception. He was number 9 in total yards after the catch, number 2 in terms of missed tackles forced on receiving plays. He's an elite wide receiver and should continue to be in that wide receiver 1 conversation when healthy. But again, considering the risk that is kind of baked in with his overall value, I could understand why somebody would want to potentially wait on Deebo Samuel in comparison to the other potential wide receivers that they could draft in the early rounds. Nonetheless, if in fact Brandon Aiyuk does not get a deal, does not play this season, obviously, Deebo Samuel will climb the rankings as such. Now, while we're on the topic within the D tier of duo wide receivers, we have Brandon Aiyuk, Deebo Samuel. Let's continue with Stefon Diggs and now Nico Collins of the Houston Texans. Nico Collins, one of the greatest late round investments from last season, immediately made an impact within this offense and delivered for our fantasy teams from weeks 1 through 20 when he was healthy. And with CJ Stroud, this guy was averaging 7.81 targets per game and 15.43 fantasy points per game. And without a doubt, last season, there was a huge uptick of overall production as soon as Tank Dell went down with his season-ending injury. And going into 2024, the addition of Tank Dell back into the offense, and of course now Stefon Diggs, certainly is a lot of target competition for Nico Collins. But like I mentioned earlier with Stefon Diggs is going to be playing the Z role, the flanker. While going into this season, Nico Collins should be the primary de facto X wide receiver of this offense. Last season, he had 85 total targets when in press man coverage. Okay, within those overall 85 targets, 61 receptions for 1,128 receiving yards. Another major stat against press coverage was a 3.47 yards per route run average, which was only second to Tyreek Hill amongst all wide receivers last season. He was number 3 in terms of missed tackles forced at the wide receiver position, again, only behind Tyreek Hill and Deebo Samuel. He should continue to improve alongside of CJ Stroud, and I understand that there is more target competition within this offense, but of course, being one of the favorite targets within this offense certainly helps Nico Collins' overall potential. Let's move on to the E tier, beginning with the number 18, Chris Olave. Chris Olave, over the course of the last 2 seasons of his career, the number 25 and the number 19 overall wide receiver. And unfortunately, last season was a little bit of a disappointment, but hopefully he can continue to improve. And as his offense changes, he can go ahead and develop it into an even better wide receiver for fantasy purposes. Last year, only got himself 8.63 targets per game and 11.74 fantasy points per game. But when given ample opportunity, 8+ targets within any of the games last season, which consisted of 11 of his 16 overall performances, he was averaging 13.7 fantasy points per game. He was number 6 amongst all wide receivers in terms of air yards, and I truly do believe that the offensive shift, going from Pete Carmichael as the former offensive coordinator to now Clint Kubiak, who was the former offensive coordinator of the Minnesota Vikings in 2021, the passing game coordinator for the San Francisco 49ers in 2023, I think that this is going to allow Chris Olave especially more opportunity in terms of finding himself in open space, making plays after the catch within a West Coast offense. The biggest roadblock, in my opinion, for Chris Olave really isn't Derek Carr, because Derek Carr has proven in the past, 2020, 2021, and 2022, that he can support a top 12 wide receiver for fantasy purposes. The biggest roadblock is red zone overall inefficiencies by the 2023 Saints. I mean, Olave only scored 5 touchdowns for a reason. And with only 11 targets within the red zone, which was only a 15% target share, and, Alvin Kamara, Taysom Hill dominating red zone overall snaps, it is a little bit risky, but nonetheless, hopefully, he can make more plays down the field, get far more yardage, receptions, etc. And Derek Carr and him continue to build a rapport to elevate him in 2024. Moving on to our number 19, we have Jaylen Waddle, who dealt with his fair share of injuries in 2023 after finishing as, a top 24 wide receiver in both his rookie year, 2021, and of course, most recently, the number 7 overall wide receiver in 2022. So when you look at his last season's contributions, in games in which he was healthy and playing, if you take those averages and span it across a 17-game pace, he was on pace for 133 targets, 92 receptions, 1,276 receiving yards, 6 receiving touchdowns, and 209.1 fantasy points, which would have had him finish as a top 10 wide receiver in fantasy. So why do I have him as number 19? I understand that playing opposite of Tyreek Hill certainly makes life a lot easier when you don't have to deal with omega triple coverage, kind of leaning on your side of the field with safety help always covering Tyreek Hill. But at the same time, when Tyreek Hill is garnering upwards of 11 targets per game on average, it takes away opportunities from, Jaylen Waddle, especially when he is not fully healthy within a given year and is trying to find his footing. I mean, last season was only averaging 7.65 targets per game, but still 13.87 fantasy points per game. The real question is, can this Miami Dolphins offense, with all they do within the running game and all that they're going to contribute in the direction of Tyreek Hill, can they support 2 top 24 wide receivers? Over the course of the last 5 seasons, when taking the overall averages of quarterbacks who have supported 2 top 24 wide receivers, we're looking for a base minimum of 4,400 passing yards and 31 passing touchdowns. Last season, Tua Tagovailoa, 4,600 passing yards and 29 passing touchdowns. Very close numbers. If he can stay within that range, Jaylen Waddle could be far better than the number 19 overall, but should very easily be a fantastic play as a wide receiver to this season. Number 20, we have DK Metcalf, who, again, amongst all these wide receivers, continues to be consistent and honestly one of the safe bets within the rounds of our drafts that, hey, if you just want someone that is going to finish between, ranks 12 through 20, DK Metcalf is that guy. Over the course of the last 3 seasons, has finished as wide receiver 12, 18, and 16. Last season averaged 7.44 targets per game and 12.03 fantasy points per game. Over the course of the last 2 seasons, with Geno Smith at quarterback, in games in which he has had 5 or more receptions, he's averaging 15.11 fantasy points per game. He was able to accomplish that in 21 of the last 34 games he's played. So as long as you get the ball in his direction at a high volume of times and get the ball in his hands. I mean, that's the whole point. You want to get the ball in your best player's hands. Hopefully, the Seattle Seahawks, their new offensive coordinator, realizes that from the get-go and continues to give opportunity to DK Metcalf so that we could potentially return to his 2020 production. I mean, 2020 was his best overall form. I mean, again, in terms of targets, in terms of receptions, across the board, in terms of touchdowns, he was a monster. And it's not for the fact that, he hasn't had red zone opportunities. He exactly has over the course of last season. In fact, the last 2 seasons, he has been top 5 in terms of red zone targets and top 10 in terms of red zone touchdowns. So those aren't the issue. It's just a matter of getting him more opportunities when he is competing with guys like JSN and Lockett within this offense, who are obviously vying for more and more targets every single year. Hopefully, we can get more opportunity in the direction of DK Metcalf. At base minimum, I think he's the number 20 wide receiver by the end of the year. He continues to stay healthy and is without a doubt a fantastic draft pick for our 2024 leagues. Moving on to our number 21, another wide receiver that is on the Los Angeles Rams, bringing up another one of these, wide receiver duos within the league. We have Cooper Kupp, who, again, like many of us know, is a former number 1 overall wide receiver back in 2021. You go to 2022, prior to his season-ending injury, was the number 1 overall wide receiver in fantasy points per game and total fantasy points per game, was dominating. But obviously in 2023, during training camp, dealt with a lot of hamstring injuries, which of course put him on the injured reserve, missed the first 4 weeks of the season. And even after he returned from weeks 5 through 17 with a healthy Matthew Stafford, still wasn't his full self. And he admitted that this offseason that he wasn't fully healthy. So going into this upcoming season, we should develop on what he was able to produce last year, which was 8.54 targets per game and 12.12 fantasy points per game with a healthy Matthew Stafford between weeks 5 through 17. So if you only build upon that, I think the number 21 overall wide receiver position is at a base minimum for him, especially considering if we have a full healthy Stafford and Kupp for the whole year. I mean, we know that his potential lies within that top 12 conversation. I don't expect him to get there, mainly because of Puka Nacua and his overall contributions there. Tyler Higbee, tearing his ACL late last season certainly does help the target opportunities for Cooper Kupp. And I purely do understand that he's going into his age 31 season. But looking at other wide receivers that are up there in age, Keenan Allen, DeAndre Hopkins, Davante Adams, Adam Thielen, these guys have been in the league this long because they are elite and they have sustained excellence. And going forward, I expect Cooper Kupp to have that in 2024. Moving on to our number 22. Let's keep with the idea of Cooper. Instead of talking about Cooper Kupp, let's talk about Amari Cooper as our number 22. Over the course of the last 2 seasons, as the primary number 1 wide receiver of the Cleveland Browns, has been the number 9 and the number 18 overall wide receiver. Now, this has been with a carousel at the quarterback position, especially last year, going from Deshaun Watson, then to PJ Walker, then to Dorian Thompson-Robinson, and finishing out with Joe Flacco. And many people will point to the idea that Joe Flacco saved Cooper Kupp's value, and without Joe Flacco, he was going to be a complete dud within the end of the year. Yes, that is a fact because Deshaun Watson got injured. And I understand Joe Flacco sending the ball in the direction of Amari Cooper 12.33 times per game that led to 24.7 fantasy point per game average is ridiculous. But when you take into account the fact that Deshaun Watson with Amari Cooper was still good, 7.8 targets per game and 14.8 fantasy points per game, I think that Amari Cooper is being highly underrated going into the 2024 year. Many of us can get him at a discount because, again, he is an older wide receiver, has dealt with injuries over the course of the last couple seasons. Again, there's the question mark that will always surround Deshaun Watson as he is still trying to find his footing within this offense, but nonetheless, Amari Cooper has demonstrated he could very easily be a top 20 wide receiver within this offense, regardless of the fact that they're a run-first scheme. Moving on to the final wide receiver within the E tier, I want to mention Michael Pittman Jr. as our number 23. Michael Pittman Jr. has finished as a top 24 wide receiver in each of the last 3 seasons, specifically number 15, number 23, and most recently number 15 again. Now, Michael Pittman Jr. last season, prior to injury from weeks 1 through 14, was averaging 10.61 targets per game and 13.38 fantasy points per game, all thanks to Gardner Minshew. In 9 of those 13 games in which he played healthy, he was getting himself double-digit targets. So, of course, Gardner Minshew helped him greatly, especially after a guy like Anthony Richardson went down with his season-ending shoulder injury. So the question is, can we anticipate very similar levels of opportunity and production from Michael Pittman Jr. this upcoming season with Anthony Richardson back in the lineup? When we go back to weeks 1 through 5 of last year, when Anthony Richardson was healthy, in terms of the overall volume of time that they played together, I went and calculated that Michael Pittman Jr. was getting about 8.46 targets per game and 11.04 fantasy points per game with a 26% target share, which again, great overall numbers for a wide receiver within that low-end wide receiver 2 conversation. But if in fact Anthony Richardson can come in and deliver double-digit targets in the direction of Michael Pittman Jr. on a consistent basis, which again isn't out of the realm of possibility, or if potentially this offense can elevate because of Richardson and of course Taylor's presence, they can score more touchdowns, maybe give more opportunity for Michael Pittman Jr. across the board, hopefully down in the red zone, because as soon as you get it in within the 10-yard line, Richardson or Taylor are scoring. It's really not going to be anything else outside of those two. Nonetheless, I do anticipate a lot of success from him. A little bit of a downtick from last year, mainly because I don't anticipate the high volume of opportunity, but hopefully touchdowns can level that out for us this year. Moving on to our number 24, to begin the next tier, we have DeVonta Smith. DeVonta Smith has been a fantastic wide receiver his entire career. Obviously, last season was a little bit of an underwhelming year, finishing as wide receiver 20. Even though, he had himself a fair share of opportunities in the absence of Dallas Goedert, which again, over the course of the last 2 seasons, he has taken great advantage of. In the last 8 games that Dallas Goedert has missed from 2022 to 2023, we have DeVonta Smith averaging 8.6 targets and nearly 15 fantasy points per game, 14.95 to be exact. But last season, he saw an overall dip in terms of overall opportunity. I mentioned it in regards to A.J. Brown. A.J. Brown got himself a career high in targets and receptions, and that was mainly because that there was a target opportunity dip for a guy like DeVonta Smith, who went from averaging 8+ targets per game the year before and now 7.0 targets per game. But even with the lack of opportunities, when healthy last year, still averaged 12.11 fantasy points per game. The question is just going to be, can he sustain lesser targets when Dallas Goedert is going to be healthy and he's not going to be absent? And can he sustain the fact that now that, besides the fact that there was Jalen Hurts dominating within the red zone, now that there's Saquon Barkley within the overall equation, is that going to hurt DeVonta Smith even more? I don't think it hurts him more, particularly because he had only 6 red zone targets last season. So going into 2024, I don't expect him to have any more. He's going to make majority of his plays within receptions and receiving yards. Touchdowns are just a luxury for us in this, overall situation with DeVonta Smith. Moving on to my number 25, we have Christian Kirk, who should be the de facto number 1 wide receiver of the Jacksonville Jaguars offense. And even though Evan Ingram is coming off an incredible, career year in which he almost broke, Zach Ertz level records, I do expect Christian Kirk, while healthy, to get back to being a sustainable fantasy option for us, specifically, either a wide receiver 2 or a high-end wide receiver 3. You go back to 2022, he finished as the number 11 ranked overall wide receiver, mainly because he scored a high volume of touchdowns, but again, still saw himself a lot of opportunity. 8.5 targets per game, 12.33 fantasy points per game. Then we transitioned to 2023. From weeks 2 through 12, all those games he played 65% or more percentage of the offensive snaps, so he was highly integrated. Within those games, 8.1 targets per game, 11.73 fantasy points per game. Throughout that span of time, the number 16 overall wide receiver and number 19 in terms of fantasy points per game on average. So going into 2024, we already know that Christian Kirk has a rapport with, Trevor Lawrence. He is going to be the number 1 option because there's no more Calvin Ridley. Zay Jones is also gone, and Jamal Agnew is also gone. I know that they're bringing in Gabe Davis and Brian Thomas Jr., the rookie wide receiver, but they aren't going to really dig into the overall workload of Christian Kirk, mainly because he is the slot-dominant wide receiver within this offense and has shown in the past that he can be a dominant force, especially within the red zone. Last season, he improved on statistics in terms of target percentage, yards per route run, and his overall catch rate. If he continues to improve over the course of his career in this offense, doesn't slow down, he doesn't deal with any injuries, as a top 2 threat within this offense that, targeted their wide receivers, the 12th most times amongst all teams over the course of the last 2 seasons, I think there is enough opportunity to go around to allow Christian Kirk to be the number 25 wide receiver at the end of 2024. Moving on to our number 26, we have Terry McLaurin. The Washington Commanders last season, like I mentioned yesterday in the running back video, was the number 1 team in terms of overall passing attempts. Yet, unfortunately, Terry McLaurin was, just an average wide receiver, averaging 9.98 fantasy points per game. Mainly because 65% of McLaurin's overall targets were deemed catchable. So there was a huge rate of 35% of his overall targets deemed uncatchable in 2023, which obviously led to his lack of overall production and his lack of a catch rate. But now that you go into 2024, they bring in the number 2 overall selection, the former Heisman winner, Jayden Daniels, as a starting quarterback, and you have a complete offensive shift with Cliff Kingsbury as the new offense coordinator. I'm anticipating a lot of success for Terry McLaurin because this will be the first time in a while that he has a stable quarterback. He has played with 11 different quarterbacks over the course of his career. And now that you have Jayden, Daniels, who is a proven, already established great quarterback that is going to just seamlessly transition into the National Football League, I anticipate to see a lot of production out of Terry McLaurin, the number 1 wide receiver of this offense. When you look at Cliff Kingsbury's offenses from 2020 to 2022, the Cardinals targeted their wide receivers the 4th most time amongst all teams throughout that 3-year span. Additionally, DeAndre Hopkins in 2020, 10 targets per game, 15 fantasy points per game. 2021, 6 targets per game, 13.5 fantasy points per game. Hollywood Brown, 10.7 targets per game, and 14.67 fantasy points per game from weeks 1 through 6 of the 2022 season prior to his injured reserve stint. Again, there's a lot of opportunity going in the direction of Terry McLaurin. I expect him to step up with the quarterback and offensive upgrades this season. Number 27, let's talk about Malik Nabers, who was a top 10 selection in the 2024 NFL Draft. Now, these are some statistics that I mentioned in regards to Marvin Harrison Jr., but they certainly apply to Malik Nabers. Since 2014, there have been 11 wide receivers that have been drafted in the top 10 of the NFL Draft. 7 of those 11 wide receivers played full healthy seasons. They averaged 127 targets, 77 receptions, 1,055 receiving yards, 7 receiving touchdowns, and 186.4 fantasy points, which again, on average, 186, that's like a top 24 wide receiver in a half PPR scoring format. Additionally, if we look at the history of wide receivers within the last 5 years who have been first-round selections, who have played at least a bare minimum of 15 games within their rookie year, they averaged 114 targets, 72 receptions, 955 yards, 6 touchdowns, and 167.73 fantasy points per game. I'm anticipating a lot of production out of Malik Nabers, mainly because he is a dominant force and a talented player. And hopefully, with the absence of Saquon Barkley, Daniel Jones has nothing else to do but throw the ball in the direction of Malik Nabers, who will be littered with targets. And even though not all of them are going to be deemed catchable or, accurate, Malik Nabers will do enough to be in this, high-end wide receiver 2 conversation, and hopefully blow right past that and establish himself as a dominant wide receiver 2 in 2024. Number 28, we have Rashee Rice. Now, Rashee Rice only sits this low because there's still a lot of uncertainty as to whether or not he is going to be suspended. Of course, a couple of his offseason kind of doings has gotten himself into a little bit of trouble. The expectation is that he's going to be suspended somewhere between 4 to 6 games. Obviously, the National Football League hasn't levied a suspension upon him, so there is a kind of expectation that perhaps he is not going to serve that suspension in 2024 as they are doing more and more research on the overall situation, similar to the way that we saw that with Alvin Kamara a couple years back. We expected him to get suspended within an overall year. The suspension didn't come until the beginning of the following season. Therefore, if Rashee Rice is not suspended and plays a full year here, we're expecting a lot of production, because once, in fact, Rashee Rice was given the starting job from week 7 through 17 of last season, he was averaging 7.4 targets per game and 12.63 fantasy points per game, having played 71% of the offensive snaps throughout that span of time. Throughout that time, he dominated 26% of the overall target percentage. He was the number 10 overall wide receiver in terms of yards per route run, number 4 in terms of overall yards after the catch, and had a 77.45% catch rate. He had the 8th most red zone targets amongst all players in the league, and the 5th most receiving touchdowns in the red zone amongst all players in the league. I understand that there's going to be a lot of opportunities for guys like Hollywood Brown and Xavier Worthy to step up within this offense, but we know that Patrick Mahomes loves his slot receiving options and is going to continue to look in the direction of Rashee Rice as long as he's on the field and not suspended. Moving on to the final player within this tier, we have Keenan Allen, newly of the Chicago Bears. Keenan Allen, throughout the last 7 seasons, 6 of those seasons has consisted of Keenan Allen being the number 14 or better overall wide receiver in a half PPR scoring format. On top of that, 5 of the last 7 seasons he has played, he has had over 100 receptions and over 1,000 receiving yards. And in 2023, he had his best season to date. From weeks 1 through 14, prior to, of course, him shutting down his season because Justin Herbert got injured, he was averaging 11.54 targets per game and 17.3 fantasy points per game. That was number 3 overall, and in terms of fantasy points per game on average at the wide receiver position last season. Again, the best season of his career, even at the age that he's currently at. So as we approach 2024, we should anticipate him to continue his level of success, assuming he gets a lot of target opportunity, because yes, there's going to be target competition with DJ Moore, Rome Odunze, DeAndre Swift, and Cole Kmet within this offense. Nonetheless, Shane Waldron has proven that he is able to support 2 top 20 wide receivers over the course of 2021 and 2022 with DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett. Last season wasn't able to have that because Tyler Lockett obviously had a lot of his opportunities go in the direction of Jackson Smith and Jigba. So going into this season, hopefully we could end up seeing Keenan Allen within a potential top 24 role within this offense. But if in fact my anticipation comes to fruition and Rome Odunze is used as much as we anticipate, it will lower the overall opportunities for Keenan Allen. He will be a wide receiver 3, but one that we can certainly rely upon in a full PPR sense. Perhaps not as dependable in a half PPR, sustainability, because touchdowns may not be a consistent part of his overall production. But nonetheless, this is a team that has the second best strength of schedule at the wide receiver position. And when we talk about elite level route runners, regardless of age, they continue to contribute. Guys like Adam Thielen, Stefon Diggs, Davante Adams, DeAndre Hopkins, guys that are finding a lot of longevity even at the end of their careers. Number 30, we have Diontae Johnson, who this offseason was traded to the Carolina Panthers to immediately be their number 1 wide receiver. Obviously, he is far younger than Adam Thielen and is immediately going to make an impact within this new Dave Canales offense. Now, last season, as a member of the Pittsburgh Steelers, when he was healthy, from week 7 through 19, he was averaging 6.77 targets per game and 10.28 fantasy points per game. And yes, that was with target competition of guys like Pat Freiermuth and George Pickens. He joins an offense now who really his only target competition is going to be Adam Thielen. And Adam Thielen, even late last season, kind of fell off because of the overall offensive shift, because the play caller changed due to the firing of the coaching staff and the whole switch that they made midway through the season within the Carolina Panthers organization. But going into 2024, Dave Canales, who was tasked to resurrect the careers of Geno Smith and Baker Mayfield over the course of the last 2 seasons, and was able to do so, his new project is Bryce Young. And how does he go ahead and try to protect Bryce Young? By bringing in wide receiver talent. And already Dave Canales, the primary play caller and the head coach of this team, has said, we want to go ahead and feature someone within every single one of my offenses. And now it's going to be, where is Diontae Johnson? How can we get him the ball? And when you look at the number 1 wide receivers of a Dave Canales-led offense over the course of the last 2 seasons, 2022 within the Seattle Seahawks offense, DK Metcalf, 12.39 fantasy points per game, nearly 9 targets per game. And last season, of course, Mike Evans, 8.4 targets per game, nearly 15 fantasy points per game. Diontae Johnson in his career from 2020 to 2023, in games in which he has had 8 or more targets, is averaging 12.94 fantasy points per game. Hopefully, they continue to litter him with targets and he can get into this wide receiver 3 conversation, even though many are underrating him going into 2024. Number 31, let's keep on the topic of Pittsburgh Steelers wide receivers, going from Diontae Johnson, a former Pittsburgh Steelers wide receiver, to the number 1 going into the 2024 season with George Pickens. Last season, George Pickens accomplished the number 26 overall wide receiver ranking with quarterbacks by the name of Kenny Pickett, Mitchell Trubisky, and of course, Mason Rudolph. Quite impressive to say the very least, but there's a lot of volatility that is baked into the overall production of George Pickens. Yes, he averaged 10.43 fantasy points per game last season, but he only had 6 games of over 10 fantasy points last year. So yes, there is volatility, there's high risk, and there's high reward. And maybe perhaps the quarterback change in this overall situation is going to lead to a high reward, especially considering last season, 21.2% of his overall targets were deemed uncatchable or inaccurate, which was the 9th highest amongst all wide receivers in 2023. So when you bring in Russell Wilson or Justin Fields to elevate him, both quarterbacks who led their wide receivers, their number 1 wide receivers, to far more fantasy points per game on average, which was Courtland Sutton and of course DJ Moore last season. Hopefully the vacancies of 140 targets with Diontae Johnson gone out of the overall equation, there may be more opportunity for George Pickens to not only be the number 1 offensive weapon for this team, but hopefully someone who's getting himself 10 plus targets every game. But the reality of the situation is that probably is not going to happen. Arthur Smith, being the new offensive coordinator of this team, didn't really help Drake London much the last couple of years. But hopefully the improvement at quarterback is going to make a huge difference and allow George Pickens to potentially far surpass the number 31 overall rank. Number 32, we have T. Higgins. Listen, T. Higgins is an incredible player. He's a wide receiver that could very easily, like George Pickens, outproduce his overall ranking here on the screen. But the thing about T. Higgins, he's very similar to Deebo Samuel in the fact that we only get a good T. Higgins when he's on the field. And he often isn't on the field because he is finding himself injured. I mean, he hasn't played a full healthy season in each of the last 3 years, but over the course of the last 3 years with a healthy Joe Burrow, I'm talking about 2023, averaging 12.96 fantasy points. 2022, 13.86. 2021, 13.01. He could very easily be a top 16 wide receiver if he plays a full 16-game season. And there is a realm of possibility in which that could happen. The Bengals last season, number 2 amongst all teams in terms of wide receiver targets. There's no more Tyler Boyd within the overall conversation. Yoshi Voss is probably going to be the slot wide receiver of this offense. And maybe, in fact, we see a little bit more contributions out of the tight end position with Mike Gesicki joining. But if, in fact, that doesn't take place and it's just going to be the T. Higgins / Jamar Chase show, I do anticipate on this prove-it year for T. Higgins, who of course is dealing with the franchise tag, to hopefully put up huge numbers so that he can find himself a huge contract in free agency next season. Moving on to our number 33, speaking of a wide receiver that delivered on his prove-it year and got himself a huge contract, specifically 4 years, $92 million, is Calvin Ridley, who is joining the Tennessee Titans. Here's the thing about Calvin Ridley. Yes, he finished as the number 17 overall wide receiver last season. Obviously benefited from the fact that Christian Kirk dealt with that injury last season. So did Zay Jones. But going into this year, there's a lot of questions as to whether or not this offense is going to be functionable. I mean, yes, you have Brian Callahan, the former offensive coordinator of the Cincinnati Bengals, who is now the head coach and primary play caller of this team. Like I mentioned just a moment ago with T. Higgins, the Bengals targeted their wide receivers the second most time amongst all teams. There may be a conversation in which they exactly do that with Will Levis this year. They have guys like DeAndre Hopkins, Tyler Boyd, Treylon Burks, the running backs who are going to be utilized within the receiving game, Chigoziem Okonkwo. There's a lot of target competition within this offense, but Calvin Ridley should be the number one. And from what we saw last season, Will Levis with DeAndre Hopkins, when Will Levis was healthy, he targeted Hopkins 8.63 times per game. That led to a 13.4 fantasy points per game average. But now that you have Hopkins, Boyd, Burks, and Ridley on the field, I expect Ridley to have a little bit less overall potential for upside, but still be a solid wide receiver 3 option within the given year. Moving on to our H tier, we have Tank Dell. Again, another one of these wide receivers that could very easily outproduce his overall ranking here. But, I mean, last season was incredible. In 2023, in games in which he played 60% or more of the offensive snaps, 8.4 targets per game, 16.23 fantasy points per game and a half PPR. And I understand that the target competition is going to be difficult with Collins, Diggs, and Schultz within the overall equation. But there have been other offenses over the course of the last 4 seasons that have been able to sustain 3 wide receivers at a high capacity, top 36 in each of their overall conversations. I'm talking about the 2021 Cincinnati Bengals, who had Chase, Higgins, and Boyd all finished as top 31 wide receivers. And we have the 2020 Steelers, who had all 3, Diontae Johnson, Chase Claypool, and Juju Smith-Schuster finished as top 24 wide receivers. So if we're in a conversation in which CJ Stroud could potentially put up over 4,000 yards and 35 touchdowns, then Tank Dell could very easily be in this top 36 conversation, assuming, of course, Stefon Diggs and Nico Collins play as well as I anticipate them to. Nonetheless, Tank's overall potential is going to be determined on whether or not CJ Stroud can elevate him to that overall capacity, because we know that Tank Dell is, a great talent. It's just a matter of, is he going to be given enough opportunity to demonstrate that in 2024? Our number 35 is Chris Godwin, who last season, had a little bit of a switch from Mike Evans. Mike Evans had a better year with Baker Mayfield than he did with Tom Brady. This was a switch. Chris Godwin had far better seasons with Tom Brady than with Baker Mayfield. With Tom Brady averaging 8.9 targets per game, 13.24 fantasy points per game throughout the 38 games they played together. Last season, Godwin with Baker Mayfield from weeks 1 through 20, while healthy, 7.5 targets per game, 9.8 fantasy points per game. Again, not great production, but with a new offensive coordinator in hand here, instead of Dave Canales, they brought in Liam Cohen, who used to be a former offensive coordinator for the Los Angeles Rams in 2022. With all of the rumors this offseason, with Todd Bowles coming out and saying that they anticipate to use Chris Godwin within the slot position, mainly because he looks healthier and faster than he ever has, they want to allow Chris Godwin to do what he does best, quote unquote, and live on the inside and make a career within the slot position. So they're going to move him back into the slot, which is only going to help Chris Godwin find mismatches and be a far more dominant wide receiver than he was in 2023. The final wide receiver I wanted to mention is Zay Flowers. Again, there are many other wide receivers that I could mention, 45 plus, that very easily I could just go through for the remainder of this video. But again, these videos take a while, and we got to get to the next position, tight ends and quarterbacks, in the upcoming days. So let's finish out with Zay Flowers. Zay Flowers from weeks 2 through 10 with Mark Andrews in the lineup, only 8.17 fantasy points per game, only 6.44 targets per game. But in the weeks in which, of course, Mark Andrews was injured last season, weeks 1 and weeks 12 through 17, Zay Flowers was a completely different animal, averaging 14.65 fantasy points per game throughout those overall games. And considering he was thrusted into the number 1 receiving option of this offense so early within his career, I think it really helped his growth. And I think going forward, it certainly is going to help him in year 2. Todd Monken's offense really wasn't one that kind of leaned upon the heavy passing game like we anticipated last offseason, but it was enough to go ahead and make Zay Flowers a valuable option. This is still an offense that is going to be number 1 within the red zone, especially considering they bring in guy like Derrick Henry, but it's going to be red zone rushing attempts rather than red zone passing attempts, which is going to hurt the overall upside of Zay Flowers, but nonetheless, still a valuable part of the top 36 wide receiver conversation. All right, guys, that covers it within my top 36 wide receiver rankings. Let me know any names that you believe should have been on today's list. Maybe guys like Jaden Reed, Ladd McConkey, Jordan Addison, DeAndre Hopkins, many of wide receivers that absolutely deserve to be in this top 36 list. But again, we can only name 36 at this current moment in time. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Be sure to click the like button, subscribe if you haven't yet already. Again, if you want my expansive rankings, be sure to go ahead and get my draft guide, my rankings via either Patreon, or go ahead and sign up via Underdog Fantasy today using code Andrew and making that first-time deposit minimum of $10. Thank you very much for watching. I'll be back tomorrow with tight end rankings at a top 18 capacity. Until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace.